same Earl Warren,
Sorry about that, guys.
was Chief Justice when the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education came before the Supreme Court in 1954. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall, had been pursuing a legal strategy of trying to make states live up to the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson that required all public facilities to be separate but equal. They started by bringing lawsuits against professional schools, like law schools, because it was really obvious that the 3 classrooms and no library that Texas set up for its African-American law students were not equal to the actual University of Texas's law school. But the Brown case was about public schools for children. It was actually a combination of 5 cases from 4 states, of which Brown happened to be alphabetically the first. The Board of Education in question, incidentally, was in Topeka, Kansas, not one of the states of the old Confederacy, but nonetheless a city that did restricted schooling by race. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document. If I'm wrong, I get shocked. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school.
So here's a good question for you then. Is they use the term separate but equal to justify segregation in schools and in public places such as bathrooms and, water areas to drink from a water fountain. So my question for you is to think about this. Is segregation equal then? Is separation actually equal? Because here, this document from the time period is saying it isn't. It's detrimental to someone. These African American students were disadvantaged or put at a worse place, into a worse place or position because they were separated out. And there was less consideration for their education or for their well-being than their quote-unquote white counterparts in schools at the time. So, I expect schools to be equal. That's my belief. Someone else might believe bathrooms should be equal. That type of thing, that anyone who needs to go to the restroom, say, I want to go to the first floor restroom, I should be able to because I have to go to the restroom like anybody else. I think those places should be equal. So, another question we need to consider, what are some things that we expect to be equal in America? Think about, is separation equal? 1. 2, what are some things, and this can be anything, this can be going to the ice cream shop or going to the movies, because at the time, even going to the movies, it was segregated. The African Americans had to get the top seats that were further back, that it made it hard to see, whereas the white children or the white people, citizens, were allowed to pick wherever they wanted to sit. And this also included buses. If you guys are familiar and remember the story of Rosa Parks and any other stories similar to it, they talk about segregation on buses as well. So, think of those questions as he attempts to answer this correctly and see if he was right.
Stan, the last 2 weeks you have given me 2 extraordinary gifts, and I am thankful. It is Earl Warren from Brown versus Board of Education. Huzzah! Justice Warren is actually quoting from sociological research there that shows that segregation itself is psychologically damaging to black children because they recognize that being separated out is a badge of inferiority. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The Brown decision was a watershed, but it didn't lead to massive, immediate desegregation of the nation's public schools. In fact, it spawned what came to be known as massive resistance in the South. The resistance got so massive, in fact, that a number of counties, rather than integrate their schools, closed them. Prince Edward County in Virginia, for instance, closed its schools in 1959 and didn't reopen them again until 1964. Except they didn't really close them because many states appropriated funds to pay for white students to attend, quote, private academies. Some states got so into the resistance that they began to fly the Confederate battle flag over their state capitol buildings. Yes, I'm looking at you, Alabama and South Carolina. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and got arrested.
There we go, Rosa Parks.
Montgomery bus boycott that lasted almost a year. A lot of people think that Rosa Parks was simply an average African-American working woman who was tired and fed up with segregation, but the truth is more complicated. Parks had been active in politics since the 1930s and had protested the notorious Scottsboro Boys case. She'd served as secretary for the NAACP, and she had begun her quest to register to vote in Alabama in
I believe Miss Hayes in her
She failed a
class
literacy
today
test
talked
one
about
time,
the
becoming
Scottsboro
one of Very
Boys.
few black people registered to vote in the state. And in 1954, she attended a training session for political activists and met other civil rights radicals. So Rosa Parks was an active participant in the fight for black civil rights long before she sat on that bus. The bus boycott also thrust into prominence a young pastor from Atlanta, the 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. He helped to organize the boycott from his Baptist church, which reminds us that black churches played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement. That boycott would go on to last for 381 days, and in the end, the city of Montgomery relented. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So that was, of course, only the beginning for Martin Luther King, who achieved his greatest triumphs in the 1960s. After Montgomery, he was instrumental in forming the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a coalition of black civil rights and church leaders who pushed for integration, and they needed to fight hard, especially in the face of massive resistance and an Eisenhower administration that was lukewarm at best about civil rights. But I suppose Eisenhower did stick up for civil rights when forced to, as when Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus used the National Guard to prevent the integration of Little Rock Central High School by 9 black students in 1957. Eisenhower was like, you know, as the guy who invaded Normandy, I don't think that's the best use for the National Guard. So Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division, not the entirety of it, but some of it, to Little Rock, Arkansas, to walk kids to school, which they did for a year. After that, Faubus closed the schools, but at least the federal government showed that it wouldn't allow states to ignore court orders about the Constitution. In your face, John C. Calhoun. Despite the court decision and the dispatching of federal troops, by the end of the 1950s, fewer than 2% of black students attended integrated schools in the South. So a modern movement for civil rights had begun, but it was clear that there was still a lot of work to do. But the emergence of the civil rights movement shows us that the picture of consensus in the 1950s is not quite as clear-cut as its proponents would have us believe. Yes, there was widespread affluence, particularly among white people, and criticism of the government in America generally was stifled by the fear of appearing to sympathize with communism. But there was also widespread systemic inequality and poverty in the decade that shows just how far away we were from living the ideal of equal opportunity. That we have made real progress, and we have, is a credit to the voices of protest. Next week, we'll see how women, Latinos, and gay people added their voices to the protests and look at what they were and were not able to change in the 1960s. Thanks for watching. I'll see you then. Crash Course is made with the help of all of these nice people, and it's possible because
They